I'm Brian Nash from How We Got Here Genealogy, and in this video I'm going to be discussing some of the first English, well, no, not English, non-French, well, really not French, but not Catholic. Yes, that would be the right phrase. Some of the first non-Catholic settlers of Nova Scotia. Collectively, they are known as the foreign Protestants of Nova Scotia. I want to thank my fellow YouTuber Jarret Ross, known as the Genea Vlogger, for spurring me on to create this video, which I hope will be the first in a series of videos on the different settlers of Atlantic Canada. And stay tuned to the end of the video where I share my experience with Jarret and tell you about his video on the same subject and the famous YouTuber who is descendant from some of these early Nova Scotian settlers. So let's start by sort of setting the picture of what's going on. These foreign Protestant settlers arrived in Nova Scotia in the first 3 years of the 1750s. But really, before we begin there, we need to turn the clock back 40 years to 1710. In 1710, Nova Scotia was called Acadie, and it was under French rule that had begun in 1604. And Port Royal, later named Annapolis by the English, had been the capital of the French colony. It was destroyed in 1613 by English raiders led by Samuel Argall, but eventually rebuilt. It consequently became a focal point for conflicts between English and French colonists for years, and it was fought over and changed hands a couple times, or almost changed hands. Anyways, this all changed on October 13th of 1710. There was an 8-day siege by the British expedition and militia from New England. So Port Royal fell and became officially a British possession. This ended French rule on the peninsula of Nova Scotia. This formally recognized in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which officially granted modern-day Nova Scotia, excluding Cape Breton, which was still called Ile Royale, to the British. Nova Scotia was very much a disputed region, and when these foreign Protestants started to arrive in 1750. And for a period until Louisbourg and Quebec eventually fell, there was still the fear of French coming back in and retaking Acadie or Nova Scotia. So the year before these settlers started to arrive in Nova Scotia was it was almost completely populated by native Mi'kmaq, which is the indigenous tribe to the Atlantic Canada, most of Atlantic Canada, except for Newfoundland. And there were about 19,000 French-speaking Roman Catholic Acadians who had sworn loyalty to the king, but it was kind of a tenuous loyalty. They just basically swore royal loyalty so they could say. So the British Board of Trade, they had a problem with this. They wanted to settle the region, but there's really the biggest issue was Nova Scotia got hard winters. It's kind of cold. You got the southern colonies of Virginia and the Carolinas were a lot more tempting to British citizens. So they wanted to try to, originally was to get English settlers, but finding that hard, they sort of compromised, and they wanted to counter the influence of the French, specifically the French Catholics, because a lot of the stuff that was going on in Europe still had religious undertones of Catholic versus Protestant. So they wanted to get Protestants, at least. If they could not get British citizens, they would at least get Protestants to settle the area. This would help with their missionary work of the Anglican Church, or the Church of England as it is rightfully called. So they really, like I said, it wasn't as much that they were concerned about the French. It was a matter of religion. So they made a plan to reach out to the citizens of the German principalities and duchies up around the upper Rhine River. It was the Duchy of Württemberg, which wound up being one of the more futile places where they found settlers, specifically in a French region called Montbéliard. I know I'm probably murdering that name. In fact, there are sometimes that these settlers are still called, though, Montbéliard settlers. But it's not quite true. They weren't, though there were significant settlers from other regions. In fact, at the point where France, Germany, and Switzerland, there's like a triangulation there where they all come together, which I'll show you on this map here. And that's where they got a good number of these settlers. In fact, my wife's family, who is on her father's side, and specifically both her father's parents, can derive their original North American heritage to this group of settlers. On actually all the sides, on her mom's side, there is on her father's mother's side, there is Swiss and German, and there's also French. On her father's side, there's Swiss and German. So they came from this group of settlers that were known as the foreign Protestants. One of the things the British did to attract these settlers was they offered free passage, and they offered them free land, and also to provide rations for a year. That was another problem with getting settlers there. Sometimes when they settled, they would come often in the early spring, early summer. They wouldn't have time to actually, it's a shorter growing season in Atlantic Canada, so they wouldn't have had time to necessarily always prepare crops for the next year. So the recruiting drive was led by John Dick, and there was over 2,000 of these settlers from 1750 to 1752. There were 12 voyages on 9 ships. 3 of these ships completed 2 voyages, or 2 crossings each. So these settlers arrived in the capital of the new British colony of Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia, for you who do not know what it means, it is the Latin translation for New Scotland. Nova being new, Scotia meaning Scotland. So these people arrived in what was essentially the capital of the new colony at this time, Halifax. Some disembarked right at the port, while others were disembarking on George's Island. If you've ever been to Halifax, if you've been to downtown Halifax, the waterfront, George's Island is a little island that sort of sits near the middle to the end of the harbor that you can see sort of from downtown. And in fact, for a number of years, I worked on the 9th floor of a building that my desk, I looked out at George's Island every day. And this was a place that, George's Island, that they did land, bring settlers originally. They also used it sometimes for quarantine settlers when they first got there. These settlers, they actually formed a little shanty town in the area of the city of Halifax. They actually were responsible for helping to build some of the initial infrastructure, because Halifax was just starting to get built up at that point. There was a citadel that was built that's still there to this day, but they were starting to build the towns, building the roads and some of the buildings. In fact, it would be a few years later that the legislature would have been built. So they even built a small little wooden church that's still there to this day. It's referred to as the Little Dutch Church. Dutch being kind of a misnomer. It's not Dutch as in we would think of Dutch as from the Netherlands, but Deutsch, meaning German for German. Things didn't bode well for them in Halifax. As they weren't really city dwellers, these were people that came from rural areas. For the most part, they were laborers. Yes, they were used to working with lumber. They were agricultural. That was their plan, was to to create farming. So they didn't get the land. They didn't get the land right away either. That was kind of causing problems, and prices were high because Halifax and Nova Scotia as a whole still didn't have the infrastructure to be self-sustaining. So there was a lot of imports still coming from England, and a lot of imports that were coming from the southern colonies. So in 1753, they finally got the land that they were promised. Governor Hobson, who was the governor of Nova Scotia, he granted them lands along the South Shore. The area was referred to Marigash. Now it's essentially it's made up of a couple of counties. Lunenburg, Queens, and Liverpool County would be the counties that sort of comprise those areas where they wound up settling, mostly in Lunenburg. So now what happened to these settlers once they got their land? They settled and created towns and villages from modern-day Liverpool all the way up to Halifax and places in between, often naming them after German communities or their own names, such as Lunenburg. In fact, there's even a community called New Germany. And if they weren't naming them after existing places or names, they would use the Germanic style of naming places. Examples would be such places as Bridgewater, and then Riverport, and then Dayspring. Now, Dayspring is actually the community where my wife's family, who descends from the Swiss Germanic part of her family, that's part of the foreign Protestants, whose original settler's name was Weigel, W-I-G-E-L, but her family now spells it Weigel, as in W-Eagle. That's where her grandfather had been born before he moved to Halifax. The South Shore area of Nova Scotia, particularly Lunenburg County, is still greatly inhabited by the descendants of the original settlers. You'll notice that many share the same common surnames, or at least the anglicized version. If white pages were still a thing, I'd be able to pull one out and peruse it, and we'd see a lot of these names in quite a bit of abundance. Now, what I can do, though, is, since I don't have a copy of the South Shore white pages, which is not something, like I said, that we have really nowadays, I do have personal experience, because I went to high school in Lunenburg County for grade 12. I went to Chester Municipal High, which is in the community of Chester. And Chester is a little community on the South Shore in Lunenburg County. This high school took in the part of Lunenburg County going from Hubbards all the way down to the Western Shore and places in between, including Tancook Islands and the Blandford Peninsula. And the Blandford Peninsula is where I lived for my grade 12 year. My father was stationed at a little tiny military station called Mill Cove. And I spent a year there from 1987 to 1988. My parents stayed a few years, but in 1988 I moved to Halifax for university. So just as a sample, if we were to look at my graduating class, the names of the students that I graduated with, there was 88 of them in total. So let's look at the names that were the same as the original settlers. So we start with Baker. Then we have Bonds, which came from Bondards. We have Butler, which came from Boutillier. There was Dories, which came from Dury. Now this one, I'm not exactly positive. This is a supplication, but based on the information I've read, this is a plausible origin of the name Dory in that area. There was the name Eisner, which would have been, there was two theories on this. It could be from the name Eisenhower's, and there's also a name that that's also named there, Meisner. It could have been an anglicization of that as well. There's Ernst. There's Froelich or Froelich, which the anglicized version and the member of my class was named Freilich. Gorkum, which got changed to Corkum over the period between the original settlers and my graduating class in 1988. Harnish, which did change a little, the spelling. It's now Harnish. Hat stayed the same. There's Hubley. This was a very common name in the area. The name did change in spelling. It was Hubley, and there are some lines apparently that dropped the H as well and just went Ubly. There was none that I knew of from my high school. After Hubley, there's Hume, which came from Hune. There was Jodrey, which came from Jodrey. There was a difference in the spelling. It's now spelled Joudrey. There was Meisner. Again, this is was a name that is still the same spelling, but there is speculation that the name Eisner could have also came from the Meisner families that were originally there. Myra or Muir, which again is a speculation. It's not. This is based on Winford Bell, who, which the records you're seeing is he compiled the records of the original settlers, and he did make some in his appendix. He did have some common name changes. So after Myra or Muir, we have Noss. Now this did change a little, so that it was now spelled Nauss instead of Nass. Sorry. There was Rafus or Rafus, as it was here. It would be now Rafuse. Rafuse would be the spelling that people would use commonly on the South Shore. Rodenizer or Rodenauser, which became Rodenizer. Saar, which became Soller. Schmidt, Schmidt and Smith. These are all names. They are believed to be the same family. Smith was the name that was common. Also, Turple. Now, in the original spelling, it was Terpell. It is now the familiarity that I use would be Turple, as in the same as purple, Turple. And then there's Walter, which became Walters, and finally Zwicker, which stayed the same. So just as a summary, now if I was to look at my class, there's 47 members of an 88-member class that shared one of these surnames. Now, whether they are a direct descendant, I can't say for sure. I'm assuming they are based on the surname, but that is 53.41% of my graduating class had a common shared surname with the original foreign Protestant settlers. And if I was to actually look beyond just my graduating class, there would be other names that would be common to the foreign Protestants that I would also find in that community, such as Canicle. Erkels, which became Barkhouse, is another example. So the names are still very prominent throughout the area. In fact, throughout the 20th century, there would have been still people who would have claimed German as one of the first languages that they learned or spoke in their home. My father used to tell me a story. I don't know how much of an urban legend this is, or was there such a thing as urban legends, when he had learned it or told me it, but that during World War II, my father would have been alive during that period, though he didn't live in the South Shore. But he said that there was stories afterwards that there had been German soldiers who would actually, their U-boats would be off the shore of Nova Scotia. They would row into shore, and they would go amongst the settlers in Lunenburg and Bridgewater, and because people spoke German, and they kind of went unnoticed. I'm assuming they weren't in their uniforms, but they would go into the local bakery and a German bakery and buy bread or other rations. It's, again, I don't know how much truth it is to that, but I do know that a lot of these families would have, until the early to mid 20th century, would have still, German would have been a language that could quite possibly have been spoken, specifically in the town of Lunenburg itself. So these unilingual German sailors speaking only German wouldn't actually necessarily been out of place, because it is quite possible that there would have been people there that were still unilingual German. Again, I'm not sure how much of that's true, or if it's, like I said, the equivalent of a 1940s, 50s urban legend. But to me, it's a believable possibility. So now at the beginning of this, I mentioned fellow YouTube genealogist Jarret Ross. So he had contacted me about these settlers. His reason is he's doing a YouTube series on the genealogies of different YouTubers. And this each season, which in the last few have been 6, 7, 8 videos, I believe, he kind of features a different YouTuber. In the current one that he's doing right now, it's on Matt Baker of UsefulCharts, the UsefulCharts channel. He has ancestors from this group of settlers. In fact, they're from a large proportion of them are from a little island called Tancook Island. Tancook Island is right there on the map, and on Tancook it's an island off the shore of Chester is how you would get there. I went to high school with people from Tancook Island. Tancook Island would be very much a community that is still to this day people that can derive their heritage from the original settlers there would all most likely be closely related or related somehow just through years of the different families marrying in different ways. There would be a lot of a breakdown of family trees and being related to people in multiple ways. So a lot of endogamy, like there is in a lot of communities. In this case, it's really ripe for it because it was not only an island, which is a common thing because it's not easy to get off the island, but also they were a cultural community as well, which people tend to marry within their cultures, especially a lot more before the 20th century. In fact, though, Matt, not only would I went to high school with people that were most likely cousins or in some form, he actually shares a common ancestor with my wife, Jean-Georges Besançon, or Besançon, as we would say in Nova Scotia generally. He was one of the original settlers, which Jarret's going to be focusing on. He was not just a direct descendant of Matt's, but he's a direct descendant of my wife's father's mother. So something I want to talk about that Because if you go over and you watch Jarret's videos, I really encourage you to. It's something I really don't really share that often, or I'm not sure how noticeable it is when I do my videos, but I have Parkinson's, which I never realized until I got it. It really manifests itself in different ways to people that are afflicted. I don't have a lot of the tremors. I do get them, but not a lot, which is what commonly people think of when they think of Parkinson's. It manifests more in some of my fine motor skills. For instance, even opening my medication, my pill bottles, is a hard thing for me. Getting the grip and stuff, doing up buttons on a shirt can be hard. One of the things that I have trouble sometimes with is my brain and my voice don't quite connect, in the sense that I can lose the and have to think about what I'm saying. And on the particular day that Jarret was interviewing me, I was having a really bad day. There was a lot of things going on in my house and my life that sort of made it a little bit stressful, and stress kind of brings out some of the symptoms. I really felt like when I was talking to Jarret, I wasn't always as coherent as I probably should have been, and even I'm a prideful person. I do rely upon my memory, and I had actually reviewed everything I was going to be speaking with them, and it was hard getting out and then finding my notes on what I was going to speak to. I really felt like I kind of let Jarret and Matt as well down, because as well as those other people that are descendants from this important group, that I wasn't necessarily giving the most of myself and the conveying the information that people needed to hear. So I really want to ask that, Jarret and them, just and you who might be related to this group, just forgive me. And in this video is one of my attempts to try to redeem myself, because I really want to urge you to watch Matt's series that Jarret is doing on his genealogy. Jarret has done 2 other ones previous to this, and I've really enjoyed watching them. Jarret does a great job at really kind of connecting the history and genealogy in each episode. Anyways, I just want to say that you can check those out here. I'll put a link up right there, and I'll put a link over here to a video of mine that you might enjoy as well. And until then, I just want to encourage you, keep searching for your ancestors.